the aftermath of yet another bombing in Syria. This video was uploaded to social media on Sunday and is said to have been filmed in the northwestern city of Idlib. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the headquarters of anti-regime fighters was the target, but the result, civilian deaths. The attack is part of the latest push by the regime to regain control of the largest rebel-held territory in Syria. Regime forces have had their sights set on the airbase of Abu Suhur and have already captured Sinjar, a town less than 20 kilometres away. They also hope to secure the Damascus-Aleppo road. It cuts through Idlib and was taken over by the opposition in 2015. Bashar al Assad's troops are backed by Russia and Iran and have regained control of more than 80 villages since October. They've pushed ahead even though Idlib is supposed to be one of the so-called de-escalation zones set up last year. These zones are supposed to provide safety to people in 4 areas, including East Ghouta outside Damascus and the northern province of Homs. But this deal is being largely ignored by the regime and violence is continuing, making life even harder for the estimated 2.5 million Syrians who call Idlib home. Volunteer groups like the White Helmets remain on the ground, putting out fires caused by airstrikes and pulling survivors from the rubble. For the thousands who have decided to leave, life is also extremely difficult. The United Nations says the situation is dire and humanitarian agencies are struggling as the Syrian war approaches the end of its 7th year. The UN estimates 60,000 people have left Idlib since November the 1st. They're heading for refugee camps close to the Turkish border and must withstand freezing winter temperatures.
والله يا خيو تدفئة ما في فلتاني لا معوني لا شيء بهالمخيم برديت لنا نطلع ما في شيء مندفع البابور هي مزبرت بيكل ما في مدركين بالحرارة حالته تعبانة معونات ما في أيام تعبانة وفقر والله الوازن كلها بيركي أولادها بيركين حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل ما بعد أحد.
Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's start this conversation with our panel. From London, we have Ammar Waqaf, the founder and director of Gnosis, a Middle East think tank. In Beirut, journalist and Syrian analyst Emma Beals. And in the studio here in Istanbul is Yasser Tabara. He's a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. But first, let's go to our TRT World correspondent, Sarah Firth, who's in Idlib province at the Bab al-Hawa crossing on the Syrian side of the Turkish border. Sarah, this is a de-escalated zone in theory. Has it felt and looked like a de-escalated zone?
No, in fact, quite the opposite, Imran. It actually has seen an escalation of violence over the last week or so in particular. Now, as we travelled through towards Idlib city centre all along the way, you could see, as well as the official refugee camps that have been there for some time now that have held people who have fled violence elsewhere in Syria, there are now additional makeshift camps that are popping up all along that route in. And we travelled to the site of that blast that took place on Sunday evening in Idlib city centre, and the destruction was just so wide-scale. You had buildings that had crumpled, and all around the area, people trying to pick through the rubble, picking up their furniture. There were lots of children around with injuries that had been treated, with wounds and injuries on their faces. And a lot of the people that we spoke to there, including some of the children who had been caught up in that attack, clearly very traumatized indeed. Now, there is some discrepancy over what exactly happened on Sunday. There were some reports that possibly it was the result of an improvised explosive device. Most of the locals there told us that it was an airstrike. We have seen an uptick in the number of Syrian regime and Russian airstrikes in the Idlib province, despite the fact it's supposed to be a de-escalation zone. In fact, even today, whilst we were in the northwest of the province, you've had reports coming from the south that airstrikes have continued. And there was a moment today when we saw a plane go overhead. I can't describe to you the feeling when you see that. Everyone goes silent, they look at the sky, they watch that plane, and then everyone breathes a sigh of relief when it passes. And that is the daily reality for these civilians living in the province right now.
And tens of thousands are on the move. Where are they going to, Sarah?
Well, that is the question. As I said, we're already seeing the evidence with our own eyes of that displacement within Idlib province itself. There's lots of makeshift camps that you can just see popping up along the road. We saw lots and lots of vehicles as well, with all their possessions loaded up on the back, sofas and clothes, all piled into the back of vans heading towards these camps. But we've spoken to aid organisations that are working in this province, and they say the camps are completely full. I'll give you an honest impression today, and it's one of a number of trips I've made recently to the Idlib province. There's a horrible sensation at the moment that it's some kind of holding pen for these civilians who fled violence. They already, many of them, have fled from other areas in Syria over the last couple of years where violence has broken out. They've travelled to Idlib province, and now with the Syrian regime seemingly making advances to take back the territory in Idlib province, they're fleeing again to this area very close to where we are on the border, but there's nowhere else for them to go. And that's what they're saying to us. They really don't know what's going to happen next. What I can tell you is very clear from the civilians we've been speaking to, from the aid organisations, they are sounding the alarm about Idlib right now. They are desperate for the international community to do something to protect them. But as I said, I mean, really it hits you when you go into the centre of Idlib, when you see the children with the injuries from the recent attacks, when you see the makeshift camps, that the situation is just absolutely desperate, and there is no way out right now for these people, and very, very little protection.
Yeah, sounds like a terrible situation for them there. Sarah, it's been great to get a feeling of the pulse of what's going on the ground. Thanks so much for joining us. Let's bring in our panel now. Let me start with Yasser Tabara. Yasser Tabara, the Russians and the Syrian regime are saying, listen, we have de-escalation zones, but they also have caveats and rules. Daesh and HTS, who are an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, or they evolved from Al-Qaeda, they're fair game, and that's who we're fighting. We're fighting terrorists, and that's why you're seeing action right now in Idlib. No other reason. Do you buy that?
If they were actually following their own rules of the game, then I think that would be closer to being fair. However, the facts on the ground tell us that the majority of the areas that are subjected to the airstrikes, whether it's in Idlib, eastern Idlib, southwestern Aleppo, eastern Hama, eastern Ghouta in Damascus, are being targeted as a means of punishment of the civilians that have been living there and have supported the opposition factions against the regime. Most of these areas, the overwhelming majority of these areas, statistically, do not include any presence of HTS or Daesh. In fact, in eastern Hama, there is a patch of land that is still controlled by Daesh that has been that has been in conflict with some of the opposition factions that are not HTS, that belong to the Free Syria Army in that area, and the regime has been striking those factions without any direct confrontation with Daesh, with ISIS. So what we see is a de-escalation zone that has been violated repeatedly since its forced implementation by Russia as the uneven broker. They have violated their own rules of the game by targeting civilians. And what we heard today in the just a few minutes ago from your correspondents in Idlib is absolutely true. They've been targeting civilians, they've been targeting infrastructure, schools, bakeries, hospitals. This is not a campaign against HTS or Al-Qaeda or Daesh in those areas. Okay,
so let's bring in Ammar Waqaf. So it's not just Yasser Tabara saying this. We have the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu saying the Syrian regime is targeting moderate opposition on the pretext of fighting al-Nusra, or HTS, terrorist group. Is he right?
Well, it's always been a blur line between these factions. You know, nobody knows where Jabhat al-Nusra starts and where Ahrar al-Sham, for example, ends. So far, what we've seen on the map, and everybody could track that the Syrian army is, going towards a plan that was leaked a couple of months ago by, there was an order by the Syrian Minister of Defense appointing General so-and-so to lead the Abu Dhuhr Liberation operation, and the Syrian army is clearly heading towards that military base or military airport, Abu Tur. In fact, they're just storming it right now. Whether the Syrian army airplanes or Russian airplanes are bombing other areas, one would suspect that they're bombing supply lines, headquarters, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
Idlib itself is a city that is dominated by Jabhat al-Nusra. They've kicked out the interim government. They're trying to impose a salvation government, whatever it is. So, in a sense, there is a blur line. With regards to Turkey, they probably feel alarmed by two facts. First of all, the influx of refugees. They don't want probably to have more refugees, and that's, I suppose, fair. And the other issue, which is the clear warning that they've issued, is that if what they call the moderate rebels, for example, Ahrar al-Sham and others, feel that they are threatened by this operation, by the bombing of various areas, then the Turkish government might not be able to advise or control their position and participation in the upcoming Sochi process, for example, or even...
Okay, so you're attributing political reasons.
Process.
Okay, fair enough. Ammar, civilians, more than 90 have been killed in 3 weeks, at least 24 killed on Sunday. No matter who you say the Syrian regime and their Russian and possibly Iranian allies are targeting, let me ask you, is it worth it?
I mean, civilian casualties is always a problem. There is a view from where I come from, for example, the people who support the Syrian government. The thing that we try to project here is that these people are hostages, and obviously it's certainly not an issue that we celebrate. Problem is that not all the deaths are caused by these airplanes. We understand that, for example, in Idlib there has been an explosion, and there have been many explosions as such in the past few weeks. And also the number of air strikes that are taking place. You know, if you have like 200 airstrikes in one day, resulting in 10 civilians, that couldn't be described as hunting civilians down, but more like a collateral damage.
Okay, so in that sense, you do say it's worth it. Let me bring in Emma Beals. Whose narrative here of what's going on in Idlib is closer to the truth, in your opinion?
Well, the idea that civilians are collateral damage in this fight against HTS and possibly ISIS is frankly ridiculous when you look at the numbers. There's 2.65 million people in the Idlib pocket, to include sort of Hama and Western Aleppo, and a couple of tens of thousands of those are HTS. We know that over 1 million of those people have been displaced at least once before. 1.7 million of them are people in need who have critical humanitarian needs that they had before this crisis began. So, to try and hunt out those couple of tens of thousands using airstrikes, which are predominantly indiscriminate, and punishing that 2.65 million people in the process is frankly deeply problematic at the very least. You also need to look at the fact that this de-escalation process looks to be a part of the ongoing reconciliation process that's happened across the country. So well over 100,000 of the people that are in Idlib have been moved from other areas of the country, forcibly displaced during reconciliation processes, and put into Idlib, where they're now being attacked, you know, in a second military campaign. So for those people, this is just a never-ending crisis, and there aren't any sort of practical solutions being offered.
Yeah, it seems to be a developing humanitarian crisis, as the UN is warning. Yasser, to Ammar's point, there was also a car bomb, likely by the group Ajnad al-Qawqaz. They seem to be from the Caucasus, 25 dead. The Syrians and the Russians will say this is what we're up against. These are the guys we're fighting. That's why we have to do the unspeakable things that we do in war. Don't they have a point?
Well, no. I mean, it's not the Russians and the Syrian regime that are up against that. It's the local population and the local administration councils and the local factions that are protecting the civilians that are up against that.
But he says there's a fine line between, say, HTS and those local fighters.
See, I mean, I think that is a line that is used by people who are not sure about the facts on the ground, who do not have information points on the ground, whether it's in Idlib or it's in Hama and Homs in Eastern Ghouta, for example. The Eastern Ghouta example is actually very, very vivid. Will bring the point very vividly. Now, the claim is that the reason for the campaign of bombardment, aerial bombardment, scorched earth policy pretty much of Eastern Ghouta was to attack HTS. And the fact of the matter is that there are no more than 300 HTS recruits or individuals on the ground in Eastern Ghouta in total. And for that to be used as a pretext for the de-escalation zone, which is part of a political process that is supposedly to deliver us from this incredible violence that has disproportionately been perpetuated by the Air Force. Let me remind your guests and your viewers that the only parties in these areas that have Air Force capability, air capability and air bombardment are the Syrian regime and the Russians.
Right.
And so the political process with the de-escalation zone is supposed to deliver us from all of this violence, and it is being used as a pretext to commit that violence in the first place. So no, I do not buy the fact that I do not buy these arguments about these blurred lines. We don't know who controls what. We've seen there are over 5-6 million Syrians that live and function and administer their own affairs in areas that are not under the control of the regime. These are people that have established local councils. The majority of these councils came to being through either a democratic or a quasi-democratic process. There are facts on the ground that support the normal daily life that has been administered by these civilians until you have airstrikes and until you have this mass violence committed against them and disrupting them and disrupting their lives in those areas.
So Ammar, the blurred lines is just a myth. It's a way to whitewash the crimes of the regime, isn't it?
No, it's not. Well, let's take Eastern Ghouta for example, or as an example, as it has been brought. Faylaq al-Rahman, which is a sizable faction, never in Eastern Ghouta, never really signed for the deconfliction zone, and it's protecting Jabhat al-Nusra, so that makes it complicit, which is by definition what the deconfliction zone agreements say. You know, if you protect or cooperate with Jabhat al-Nusra, that makes you complicit. So, you know, the Syrian army, why do we have the feeling that the Syrians who are in those areas would want to live under Jabhat al-Nusra or Faylaq al-Rahman or Jaysh al-Islam or Ahrar al-Sham or whatever it is? Some of them at least might be longing for the government to come and free them. So I would argue that a lot of people in those areas would welcome with open hands.
Free them by what?
Airstrikes.
60,000 people are on the move right now.
Yeah, but, you know, take Eastern Aleppo, for example. I think that's the most statistically sound, battle that happened. Only 30,000 fighters, along with their families, were evacuated out of, what, I don't know, about 250,000 people. All the others went to live under government control. Some of them even dared to cross the line. And this is another issue. In Eastern Ghouta, people are not allowed by these factions to cross the line into government territories. They keep them as hostages.
I'm sorry, but is that why the thousands of civilians in Western Ghouta were freed by being evacuated to a completely different part of, were basically been taken away from their homes, from their lands, and been completely displaced into a completely different area in Syria, whether it's in the north or in other places.
Who are evacuated,
those civilians do not want to be, I guarantee you, by a regime that has been air bombarding them for the past 7 years.
Look, I'm sorry. Our understanding is that Daraya, Western Ghouta, whatever it is, those who are evacuated, and even in Aleppo, Eastern Aleppo, those who are evacuated are militants and their families, and that's it. So people who are fleeing, you know, they might be fleeing at the moment in Idlib and northern Hama, they might be fleeing the fighting, which is fair and natural and so on.
I'm sorry, but I think your information is not accurate whatsoever.
And would like to live under their auspices.
Okay, let's bring in Emma. Emma?
Well, the idea that all of the people that were evacuated from these areas were militants and their families is preposterous, frankly. I mean, there was human rights workers, there was aid workers, doctors, lawyers, journalists, anyone who's involved in civil society, which is a political opposition to the government, who's been seen as a bigger threat than the militants, was evacuated. There were lists given in some of these areas with specific names of people who had security threats against them. I mean, actually, militants were given more of an opportunity to reconcile their affairs with the government than civilians were. So the idea that you're saying that these people were evacuated that were only militants and everybody else was happily living under the government is ridiculous, as is the idea that we would use eastern Aleppo as an example of a success story. Because even though by the time that pocket had become besieged, there was a smaller number of people that were still living there, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been permanently displaced and who will continue to be permanently displaced because of what's going to happen in that part of the city from now on. So
I think
this idea that these are a success story somehow, or that
9 out of 10
we're liberating
in
Idlib.
eastern Aleppo chose to go under the government control. I think that's what's ridiculous. You know, if we have certain militants, about 1,000, 10,000,
but there was more than 2 million people in eastern Aleppo before the.
They're never going to reconcile.
But before the barrel bombing
evacuated.
campaign, there were hundreds of thousands of people in
Eastern Aleppo chose to rejoin with the government and bring their lives to normal. How can we say that the government is the aggressor here?
I don't know. I don't know which planet you have to be on. I don't know which planet.
And what have you, Islamic organizations.
I'm sorry, but I don't know which planet you have to be on in order for you to not acknowledge the official line of Bashar al Assad and of the Syrian regime when they say that what's been taking place is some form of cleansing of anybody who disagrees. Now we are achieving a more homogeneous form of society. When you talk about Aleppo, that's exactly what the regime was aiming for, and that's exactly what the regime got through carpet bombarding an entire areas of eastern Aleppo and wiping it off the face of the earth. This is, if that is what you mean by achieving some form of harmony and some form of a happy-go-lucky population that lives and under the confinement of the Syrian regime, then yes, your regime has achieved its goal and has achieved the harmony that it seeks.
Ammar?
Okay, well, what the Syrian government means by harmonious society is that she wants, or we've probably achieved a society where people don't accuse each other of being this sort of faction and that sort of faction. You know, everybody is a Class A citizen. And this is the project that runs against the project.
And that's why there are tens of thousands of detainees that are being starved to death in the prisons as we speak.
This faction is a majority and that faction is a minority. We're Class A citizens. These are Class B citizens. That's what the Syrian people and the harmonious society that remains now in Syria has managed to achieve.
Been the case. And that's been the case before 2011. And that has been the case before 2011. Has that been the case before 2011?
Well, there's nothing constitutionally to say before 2011 that a person from this faction is a Class A citizen, and this person, it was not like Lebanon or Iraq
there are
or whatever
nothing in the
and
discourse.
Syria will remain.
There's nothing in the discourse or the documentations of the opposition that has been issued since 2011 till today that is contrary to a society that does not discriminate, a constitutionally bound society under the rule of law that is ruled democratically. Every single document.
But is this what the Muslim Brotherhood really want? Really,
okay.
Come on.
Well, okay. So now you brought in the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, you said there's a fine line between sort of Daesh and Al Qaeda.
I suppose that's what the Ba'ath.
Okay, this is interesting. We've got the Muslim Brotherhood to come in, but I mean, Ammar, you would admit that it takes a certain amount of obfuscation to pretend that pre-2011 everything was wonderful under the Ba'ath Party and Syria was a model secular democracy. I think that would be pretty disingenuous from you.
Things are wonderful in Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Or
okay, you want to talk about Jordan and Saudi Arabia? Let me ask Emma. I want to give. Okay, fine. I want to give Emma. I want to give Emma the final word.
The Americans didn't want to have
Okay, fair enough. Emma, let me bring you in here. We're at the beginning of 2018. The balance of power seems to be with Bashar al Assad, the Russians, the Iranians. We have these de-escalation zones. The international community is probably boxed in, isn't it? Because it had deals that came out of places like Astana and Sochi. And we see what's going on right now in Idlib. Does it disappoint you? What happens to this war now, given that the balance of power is in the hands of Assad and its allies, it seems?
Well, the really dangerous thing that's been happening lately in the discourse around Syria, from where we are now, is that the that people think the war is ending because there is a reduction in the immediate physical conflict violence in some areas of the country. People think that the war is sort of closing down, and so that's why nobody's paying particular amount of attention to Idlib. That's why what's happening in Eastern Ghouta is happening. That's why people were prepared to make these deals. But what hasn't been coming out is the effect of some of these deals on the people that are still living there. So lots of these areas that were formerly reconciled, they're still being deprived of services. They're not secure. So there's an ongoing structural violence still being perpetuated against certain groups of people, including people who are displaced. So that includes the people in Idlib who are displaced. It includes the people in neighboring countries and further afield. And what's going to happen unless people start pushing it back against some of these deals fairly urgently is that this is going to be an ongoing crisis where there may be a reduction in immediate sort of conflict violence in some areas in the short term, but there won't be any sort of medium or long-term solution that's fair or equitable for all of the people of Syria.
Okay, unfortunately we're out of time. I have to move on, but I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Ammar Waqaf, Emma Beals, Yasser Tabara, and of course earlier our correspondent Sarah Firth on the ground. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.